A family cooks dinner in a street in Mohenjo Daro. Sometime after 1900 BCE, the street used to be 7 meters wide, laid out on a perfect grid. Now a mud brick wall cuts straight across it. The city's famous drainage channel, once cleaned weekly by municipal workers, sits packed with silt underneath their fire pit. Nobody dug it out. Nobody seems to have planned to. The popular version says this civilization died suddenly, wiped out by invading Aryan warriors or an earthquake or a plague that emptied entire cities within a generation. It's a clean story with a villain and a date. It's also almost entirely wrong. Around 2600 BCE, while Egypt built pyramids and Sumer built ziggurats, a third Bronze Age civilization was quietly outbuilding both of them. The Indus Valley Civilization, sometimes called Harappan, after one of its major cities, eventually covered over 1 million square kilometers across what's now Pakistan and northwest India. More than 1,000 identified settlements. Cities like Mohenjo Daro and Harappa had covered drainage systems, standardized brick sizes used across 1,000 kilometers, and public wells serving individual neighborhoods, technology many. Bronze Age cities elsewhere wouldn't see for another 2,000 years. There's no evidence of kings. No grand palaces, no royal tombs stuffed with treasure, no monumental statues of rulers. What survives instead is bureaucracy. Thousands of small carved seals, a uniform system of weights used from the Arabian Sea to the edge of the Himalayas, and a script that still hasn't been deciphered. This was a civilization organized around trade and standardization, not conquest. Before the escalation begins, it's worth understanding what this civilization was actually built on top of. The entire Indus system depended on a monsoon pattern that had been remarkably stable for well over 1,000 years. Predictable summer rains feeding rivers that flooded on a schedule farmers could plan around. That stability wasn't a given. It was a narrow climatic window, sustained by ocean and atmospheric patterns across the Indian Ocean. And it had held steady for so long that no one alive would have had any cultural memory of it working differently. Cities weren't built with contingency for that pattern breaking. Granaries, drainage systems, and settlement locations were all placed assuming the rivers would keep behaving the way they always had. That assumption is the real antagonist of this story. Not a person, not an army, but a climate system nobody understood well enough to see changing until it already had. Around 1900 BCE, something in the water started changing. Rivers that had fed Indus agriculture for centuries began shifting course or drying up seasonally. The Ghaggar-Hakra river system, which some researchers connect to the lost Sarasvati River, described in later Vedic texts, appears to have lost much of its year-round flow. Farmers who depended on predictable flooding to plant were suddenly working with rivers that no longer showed up on schedule. The disruption wasn't isolated. Paleoclimate researchers studying sediment cores and cave formations across the region have found signs of a broader weakening in monsoon patterns starting around this period. Less reliable summer rains stretching from the eastern Mediterranean through South Asia. For a civilization whose entire urban infrastructure was built assuming consistent water, a multi-generational shift in rainfall wasn't a disaster. It was a slow, compounding tax on everything. Trade felt it too. Mesopotamian cuneiform records mention a trading partner called Meluha, widely believed to be the Indus Valley, with references to Meluhan ships, timber, and carnelian beads appearing in Sumerian and Akkadian texts. Those references become rarer after roughly 1900 BCE, long distance. Exchange networks that had helped fund urban infrastructure for centuries began thinning out at almost exactly the moment agriculture got harder. To understand what was being lost, it helps to look at the scale of what these cities maintained. Mohenjo Daro's drainage network ran beneath nearly every major street, built from fire bricks manufactured to a ratio of 4 to 2 to 1 that stayed nearly identical across settlements 1,000 kilometers apart. That level of standardization that required centralized coordination shared measurement standards, and steady labor investment year after year. The great granary at Harappa, along with similar large storage structures found at other major sites, was built to hold surplus grain at a scale meant to buffer entire cities through bad harvests. Keeping a system like that running wasn't a one-time construction project. It required constant labor to clear silt, replace bricks, manage storage, and coordinate supply across dozens of dependent settlements. Every one of those tasks assumed a workforce large enough and a surplus consistent enough to justify the effort. When the agricultural base underneath that system began to wobble, the infrastructure didn't collapse instantly. It just became more expensive to keep alive than the population could justify paying for. Here's where the invasion story falls apart. If Aryan warriors or any invading force had swept through and destroyed these cities, archaeologists would expect to find what they find at genuinely conquered Bronze Age sites: mass graves, burned layers across multiple structures, weapons embedded in skeletal remains, sudden destruction horizons. At Mohenjo Daro and Harappa, none of that shows up at any meaningful scale. A handful of unburied skeletons found decades ago in Mohenjo Daro were once cited as invasion victims. Later analysis dated them to different periods entirely, some possibly just unceremonious burials during a period when formal burial practices were already breaking down. The Aryan invasion model itself has been largely abandoned by archaeologists and geneticists since the late 20th century. Genetic studies now support a slower migration of Indo-European-speaking pastoralist groups into South Asia over centuries, not a single military conquest. The timing doesn't even line up. The major Indus cities were already in decline before most proposed migration windows begin. The civilization wasn't murdered. It was already coming apart from something structural. There's a smaller myth worth dismantling here too, that Mohenjo Daro was destroyed in some kind of ancient nuclear-level catastrophe based on misreadings of vitrified material found at the site decades ago. Later geological analysis attributed that vitrified debris to ordinary kill activity and ceramic production, not any singular cataclysmic event. And a related idea that the Indus script represents a centralized priesthood issuing religious decrees, similar to Egyptian temple inscriptions, has also lost ground. Most surviving Indus inscriptions are short, appear on trade seals and pottery, and look far more consistent with commercial record-keeping than religious authority. The pattern keeps repeating across this civilization story. Dramatic, centralized explanations get proposed, then quietly corrected by evidence pointing towards something more distributed and less cinematic. What archaeologists now describe isn't collapse, it's urbanization. As rivers shifted and monsoons weakened, the economic logic that justified massive centralized cities started to break down. Maintaining city-wide drainage, standardized production, and long-distance trade infrastructure only makes sense when there's enough surplus and enough people concentrated to justify it. When agricultural output became less predictable, that surplus shrank, and the incentive to stay clustered in enormous planned cities shrank with it. So people didn't disappear. They redistributed. Excavations show population shifting away from the largest Indus cities toward smaller, more dispersed settlements, many moving eastward toward the Ganges-Yamuna plain, where rainfall remained more reliable. Village-scale farming communities increased even as the great cities emptied out. Craft traditions, pottery styles, and even some Harappan symbols persisted in these smaller communities for centuries afterward. The civilization didn't end in an event. It thinned out, city by city, decision by decision, as thousands of individual households concluded that staying in a shrinking metropolis made less sense than leaving. Picture that same street in Mohenjo Daro a little more fully. The grid that once organized this city with near mathematical precision is still visible underfoot, but only in outline, like a map someone stopped updating. The public well 2 blocks away, once shared by dozens of households under an informal but understood rotation, now serves only the handful of families who never left. Smoke from cooking fires rises from courtyards that used to be workshops. Somewhere nearby, a wall of unfired brick, built in haste and without the old standardized dimensions, blocks what used to be a thoroughfare wide enough for carts. No one argues about it. No city council convenes to object. The people still living here aren't defending a dying capital. They're quietly repurposing what's left of it into something smaller and more manageable, brick by brick, without ceremony, because the institutions that once cared how the city looked stopped having the resources to care. Which brings us back to that family cooking dinner over a silted-up drain in a street subdivided by a wall that shouldn't be there. They weren't the last survivors of a massacre. They were mid-transition, living in a city that was still functioning, just no longer worth maintaining at its original scale. The wall across the street wasn't an act of chaos. It was one household quietly deciding to build a smaller, more defensible space inside a city that had stopped enforcing its old plan, because the institutions that once enforced it no longer had the surplus to bother. This pattern shows up whenever a system's maintenance costs quietly outpace what its members are willing to pay. Large, centralized structures, bureaucracies, institutions, even cities, don't usually die in a single dramatic failure. They lose the specific conditions that justified their scale, and the people inside them start making small, individually rational choices to disengage, relocate, or downsize. From outside, decades later, it can look like nothing happened until suddenly, the grand structure just isn't there anymore. From inside, at the time, it felt like nothing more than one reasonable decision after another. If a civilization can spend centuries quietly stepping back from its own greatest achievement without anyone deciding to end it, what does that suggest about the difference between an ending we'd actually notice and one we'd only recognize by looking back? If you love exploring ancient enigmas like this, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation.